The subcommittee, the subcommittees on health, employment, labor, and pensions, and workforce protections will come to order. Welcome, everyone. I note that a quorum is present. The subcommittees are meeting today in a hearing to receive testimony on the future of work and preserving worker protections in the modern economy. Pursuant to Committee Rule 7C, opening statements are limited to the chairs and the ranking members. This allows us to hear from our witnesses sooner and provides all members with adequate time to ask questions. I recognize myself now for the purpose of making an opening statement. Today, we are gathered for the first of 3 hearings to explore the future of work. This series of hearings will provide an opportunity for experts and stakeholders to share how evolving business models and rapidly changing employment arrangements, coupled with increased use of technology and automation, are impacting workers and employers. We look forward to hearing ideas on policy options that ensure innovation complements worker protections, civil rights, and economic security. Today's hearing will focus on how Congress can ensure that workers have fair wages, hours and benefits, safe workplaces, and an opportunity to bargain for better working conditions at a time when American workplaces are rapidly shifting. For most of the 20th century, companies primarily hired workers directly, but over the last 3 decades, there have been a fissuring of the workplace where companies are increasingly shifting employment to subcontractors, temporary workers, or workers misclassified as independent contractors. The most visible example of the fissured workplace can be found in the on-demand economy, where some companies misclassify their workers as independent contractors. The employment relationship is key to our nation's foundational labor and employment laws, and the erosion of this relationship threatens to not only undermine our nation's labor laws, but to also erode the progress we've made towards a strong American middle class. That is why preventing worker misclassification and strengthening and maintaining joint employment standards are key to ensuring that workers have access to legal protections and can exercise their rights. For example, in my district in Miami, Florida, a large swath of workforce is subcontracted or temporary workers who are hired to support the large tourism, hospitality, and health industries. These workers, who are the backbone to multiple billion-dollar industries, are currently limited to their abilities to collectively bargain and advocate for themselves. In most cases, workers are being forced to work in extremely unsafe conditions. A full revamp of worker protections is necessary to ensure safer working conditions and better benefits. The right to organize, as the law currently stands, does not empower our constituents to harness their true economic potential. The Protecting the Right to Organize Act, that we call the PRO Act, which we recently advanced through this committee, would strengthen joint employment standards under the National Labor Relations Act to ensure that workers can bring to the negotiating table all of the companies that have a say in the terms and conditions of employment. The PRO Act would also broaden the NLRA's employment standards to prevent workers from being misclassified as independent contractors and thereby deny their rights to organize and collectively bargain. Now that the PRO Act has advanced through our committee, we must continue our discussion for ways to complement and strengthen our current labor laws. Today, we will examine whether or not bargaining can be used to establish industry-wide floors that prevent individual employers from undercutting wages and working conditions in order to compete. I also look forward to a discussion about how to ensure benefits provided to workers in the Fissured workplace truly achieve meaningful improvements for workers. Innovation is not compatible with collective bargaining rights or good workplace benefits. Congress has a responsibility to ensure that the changing economy does not undermine the rights of American workers. Today's hearing is an important step towards shaping a future of work that facilitates innovation and growth while preserving the worker protections and benefits that help from the core of American prosperity. I would like to thank our witnesses for joining us today, and I now recognize Health Ranking Member Wahlberg for an opening statement. Mr. Wahlberg.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Today we are here to discuss the future of work. Madam Chair, I vote in favor of the future of work. It's a good thing, and so it's worth moving forward. But with the ever-evolving economic landscape, which in fact is pretty good right now, with the lowest unemployment rate for all sectors, or at least most all sectors in history, at least in the last 50-plus years, and the increased wage for middle class expansion taking place, the landscape is pretty good. It's an important issue, though, for us to consider. Yet I find it ironic, given committee Democrats recently passed radical legislation, the PRO Act, that would take our labor laws back to the 1930s. My colleagues across the aisle, I seem to feel that they believe that forcing workers into labor unions is the only way to ensure proper wages and benefits. So federal law should promote unions even at the expense of workers' own rights and freedoms and choices. Democrats' ultimate goal, it appears, is to all but eliminate independent contractor status, classifying as many workers as possible as employees in order to subject them to unionization. Labor union membership continues to plummet due to the modern economy, economic growth, and unions' own failings. Instead of increasing transparency and accountability to serve their members better, union leaders are exerting their political influence to push backward-looking radical labor laws that would allow them to consolidate power, further coerce workers, line their own pockets, and bolster their own agendas while depriving workers of freedom, flexibility, and innovation in the workplace. It appears that Democrats' reforms would take us back to the past while harming workers, businesses, and the economy as a whole at a time when economic growth and innovation are creating real progress and prosperity for American workers. That's why committee Democrats recently approved H.R. 2474, far-reaching legislation which limits the rights of workers to make free and informed decisions. This is not what the future of work in America should look like or needs to look like. There's nothing progressive about what will be discussed during this hearing. Instead of considering unworkable policies that will harm workers and businesses, we should be discussing ways to encourage flexible work arrangements and access to employer-sponsored benefits without creating costly and restrictive mandates. These are the kind of reforms necessary to adapt our laws for the future of work. For example, multi-employer plans should allow small employers to join together to sponsor a single retirement plan for employees, which would significantly reduce costs for employers who might not otherwise be able to afford offering retirement benefits. Additionally, committee Republicans have long championed the expansion of association health plans, which allow small businesses to join together to provide their employees with high-quality health care at more affordable costs. These are just two examples of innovative reforms that meet the needs of a 21st century workforce. American workers are benefiting from strong economy ushered in by Republican-led tax and regulatory reform. Wages are rising. Unemployment is near record lows, and millions of jobs have been created since President Trump took office. Individual freedom and pro-growth economic policies create the best path forward for workers and job seekers, not more coercion and red tape. That's what I believe. Madam Chair, I'm going to stick to it, but look forward to participating in this hearing, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Wahlberg. I now recognize Workforce Protection Subcommittee Chair Adams for an opening statement.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman Wilson, and thank you to the witnesses for being here today. The Foundation Federal Protections for Workers, including fair wages, reasonable hours, and safe workplaces, are grounded in two key employment laws, the Fair Labor Standards Act and the Occupational Health and Safety Act. These landmark laws were passed when the overwhelming number of workers and employers were connected through traditional direct relationships. An employee could tell who their employer was by looking at the name on the building where they worked. But as the relationship between workers and employers is changing, the protections provided by our key labor employment laws are eroding. For example, the rising trend of working misclassification, in which a worker who should be an employee under the law is as an independent contractor, is undermining the Fair Labor Standards Act. When employees are misclassified, employers are able to strip workers of minimum wage and overtime protections and gain an unfair competitive advantage by classifying them as independent contractors. Similarly, the lack of clarity in work arrangements can undermine the safety of workers because there's less certainty about who's responsible for supplying safety equipment and safety training. This adds risks for temporary and contract workers who are twice as likely to die from falls than workers in traditional employment, according to Labor Department data. And workers who are misclassified do not have protections under federal whistleblower laws, including the anti-retaliation provisions of the Occupational Safety and Health Act and other whistleblower laws overseen by OSHA. As our witnesses will discuss today, we don't have to choose between strengthening and modernizing protections for American workers or building a vibrant modern economy. Without innovation, workers and businesses may lose out on opportunities to succeed. But without a strong and sustained effort from federal policymakers, the changing relationship between workers and employers and the emergence of new business models and new technology will continue to erode the financial security and safety of America's workers. We can have an economy that values workers and an economy where business can succeed. Proposals we've previously discussed in this committee, including the Payroll Fraud Prevention Act, would be important steps in the right direction. All of us agree that the foundational labor and employment laws are outdated in the modern economy. So the question at the heart of today's hearing is whether we will update and strengthen those protections or further weaken them. The future of work will be determined by our answer to that question. I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Chair Adams. Our ranking member of Workforce Protections, Member Bryan, will join us later. He's unable to be with us now, and he will be able to give his opening statement. Without objection, all other members who wish to insert written statements into the record may do so by submitting them to the committee clerk electronically in Microsoft Word format by 5 p.m. on November 5th, 2019. I will now introduce our witnesses. David Weil is the Dean and Professor of the Heller School for Social Policy and Management at Brandeis University. Mr. Weil serves as the Administrator of the Wage and Hour Division of the U.S. Department of Labor under President Barack Obama from 2014 to January 2017. Welcome. Brasheen Rogers is an associate professor of law at Temple University School of Law, at Temple University Beasley School of Law, and a fellow at the Roosevelt Institute. Professor Rogers' research focuses on labor and employment, concentrating on how the law shapes workers' collective action, the impact of technology on employment practices, and the relationship between law and inequality. Rachel Grisler is a research fellow in economics, budgets, and entitlements at the Heritage Foundation. Ms. Grisler provides research and commentary on workplace issues, including federal employee compensation, women's issues, and labor policies, such as minimum wage and paid family leave. Jessica Beck is the co-founder and chief operating officer of Hello Alfred, a technology and residential service company that is changing the way people live in cities by integrating health directly into the home through a combination of technology, smart data, logistics, and high-touch hospitality. Ms. Beck and her co-founder, Marcella Sapone, built a service-based business that assists households in more than 20 cities across the United States. I appreciate all of the witnesses being here today, and we all look forward to your testimony. Let me remind the witnesses that we have read your written statements, and they will appear in full in the hearing record. Pursuant to Committee Rule 7D and committee practice, each of you is asked to limit your oral presentation to a 5-minute summary of your written statement. Let me also remind the witnesses that pursuant to Title 18 of the U.S. Code, Section 1001, it is illegal to knowingly and willfully falsify any statement, representation, writing, document, or material fact presented to Congress, or otherwise conceal or cover up a material fact. Before you begin your testimony, please remember to press the button on the microphone in front of you so that it will turn on and the members can hear you. As you begin to speak, the light in front of you will turn green. After 4 minutes, the light will turn yellow to signal that you have 1 minute remaining. When the light turns red, your 5 minutes have expired, and we ask that you please wrap it up. We will let the entire panel make their presentation before we move to member questions. When answering a question, please remember to once again turn your microphone on. I will first recognize Dr. Weil. Welcome.
Thank you, Chair Wilson, Chair Adams, Ranking Member Wahlberg, Ranking Member Barn, and members of the subcommittees. My name is David Weil, and I am the Dean of the Heller School for Social Policy and Management at Brandeis University, and I did have the honor of serving as President Obama's Administrator of the Wage and Hour Division at the U.S. Department of Labor from 2014 to 2017, when I had the honor of appearing before this committee on several occasions. I offer these comments regarding the topic of today's hearing, informed by my past and ongoing academic research, as well as my experience as the head of the federal agency in charge of enforcing our most basic labor standards. We can understand the future of work by understanding the present of work. In the past few years, there have been innumerable conferences and convenings on the future of work. These meetings typically focus on issues like robotics, artificial intelligence, and platform or gig business models like Uber and Lyft. But gig work is currently estimated to affect a very small part of our labor force, and speculations on the impact of technology in the past have often proven to be off the mark. A focus on changes that are already impacting working people and will continue to do so, in my view, is far more useful. Millions of workers in the U.S. have jobs that don't pay enough, provide few, if any, benefits, and lack basic workplace protections we once took for granted. Most relevant here, employers have moved away from a traditional employment model and towards greater reliance on outsourcing, contracting, and subcontracting, franchising in its many forms, and most recently, platform business models. This change that has been described by the subcommittee chairs represents both the present and the future structure of work, and is what I have termed the fissured workplace. The fissured workplace model has allowed employers to shift risks and responsibilities onto workers and has incentivized the misclassification of employees as independent contractors. We cannot understand policy solutions without understanding the way we got here, which I have outlined in detail in my written testimony and academic writings. The fissured workplace has social and economic consequences for workers. As you move downward in a fissured workplace structure, incentives to cut corners rise, leading to violations of our fundamental labor and employment standards, such as the minimum wage, overtime, or even the basic concept that people should be paid for the work they do. For a family struggling to get by, the typical losses arising from these violations translate to more than 5 weeks of groceries, a month of rent, or 5 weeks of childcare. Different forms of workplace fissuring can also undermine providing workers safe and healthful workplaces. Compared to their employee counterparts, independent workers have a disproportionately higher chance of injury or death. Because of its concentration, particularly in low-wage sectors, the fissured workplace significantly impacts people of color and women and compounds the historic and systemic disparities that have faced them in the workplace. And the fissured workplace is prevalent throughout the economy. The impact of fissuring on wage and hourly structures of the economy is sizable. My conservative estimate of workers operating in highly fissured industries says that we have over 23 million workers, or about 19% of the private sector workforce. If we consider the additional workers and occupations in industries with partial presence of fissured practices, my estimate of its prevalence would exceed 35%. It is therefore essential that our public policies address fissuring. Our policies need to provide rights and protections for workers in this increasingly challenging environment. My colleague Tanya Goldman and I outline a proposal to provide basic protections to workers, employees, and independent contractors in ways that recognize changes in the workplace that I have described. We do so by defining 3 concentric circles of workplace rights and protections. An inner circle would assure fundamental rights like receiving minimum payment for work, provision of a safe and healthful workplace, and protections against retaliation for use of rights guaranteed to all workers regardless of employment status. A middle circle would provide employee rights and protections emanating from a clear and consistent definition of employment. And finally, an outer circle would provide access to safety net benefits like unemployment insurance and workers' compensation and non-mandatory benefits like retirement. But laws are only as good as our ability to enforce them. When I led Wage and Hour Division, it had 1,000 investigators in the field, even though the agency had responsibility for 7.3 million establishments. Enforcement agencies need sufficient number of investigators and tools to do their work. New technologies.
Thank you, Dr. Weil.
Thank you.
We will now recognize Professor Rogers. Welcome.
Madam Chair Wilson, Madam Chair Adams, Ranking Members Wahlberg and Byrne, and members of the subcommittees, thank you for this opportunity to testify today. My name is Brescian Rogers. As the chair said, I'm a professor at Temple University, Beasley School of Law, and a fellow at the Roosevelt Institute. I'm also currently a visiting associate professor at Georgetown University Law Center. I'm here in my individual capacity, not representing an organization. I have been asked to discuss 2 issues related to the present and future of work. The first is whether to reform our labor laws to encourage more centralized forms of bargaining and standard setting. The backdrop here is that an important goal of unions and public policy is to take wages out of competition to prevent a race to the bottom. This is good both for workers and for responsible employers. But our labor law today makes it quite difficult by encouraging enterprise-level bargaining, or bargaining at the individual worksite or firm. Now, unions have worked around this when possible. The UAW's pattern bargaining strategy is a great example. But it's very hard to do in today's economy, in part for reasons that my colleague Dr. Weil just mentioned. To illustrate, consider how fast food workers might try to build a pattern bargaining structure today. They'd first have to organize one McDonald's restaurant at a time. Now, the PRO Act would make it much easier for them to do so. That's essential, but it's arguably not enough. In order to get to scale, they'd have to organize individual restaurants and then merge them into a larger bargaining unit. Franchisees could refuse to enter that unit, and whether or not McDonald's is an employer of the workers at issue will determine whether it needs to be a part of the unit. Even if the workers succeed in building a nationwide unit of McDonald's workers, they'd have to do that with all of the company's competitors. That's effectively impossible today. Enterprise bargaining is quite unusual in comparative perspective. In continental Europe, collective bargaining typically involves unions and employer associations that negotiate agreements across entire industrial sectors. There's a significant amount of evidence that those practices encourage both more economic equality and they protect responsible employers against unfair competition without having negative effects on economic performance. We could draw lessons from those systems and from our own history to develop more centralized forms of bargaining or standard setting. I'll say just a tiny bit about how we could potentially do that. One option would be for Congress to amend the Fair Labor Standards Act to create industry committees or wage boards with the power to set minimum terms at the sectoral level. We did this under the Fair Labor Standards Act as originally passed. The committees could have equal members of representatives of employers and workers, could take public testimony, deliberate, and recommend minimum terms for the sector to the Department of Labor. As an alternative or a supplement, Congress could revise the NLRA to enable true sectoral bargaining or bargaining between unions and firms across a sector. Now, it would be unwise to simply substitute sectoral bargaining for enterprise bargaining, but Congress could, for example, mandate or encourage multi-employer bargaining. They could also enable unions who are organized or who have organized at the enterprise level to also negotiate at the sectoral level, perhaps by granting bargaining rights in stages based upon the amount of support a union has within the relevant sector. I'd be happy to discuss details of either of these ideas in the Q&A. I'll note, though, that both of them would ideally supplement and bolster enterprise bargaining rather than replacing it. Enterprise bargaining still has to be the foundation of an industrial relations system in this country. The second issue I've been asked to discuss is the idea of portable benefits. The developments that I noted earlier and those discussed by Dr. Weil have also eroded employees' or workers' access to benefits. One reason is that our laws require companies to provide benefits to employees in many instances, but not to independent contractors or to employees of their subcontractors. A number of gig economy companies and think tanks have proposed that we enact safe harbors, which would allow them to provide benefits to their workers without the risk that they would then be classified as those workers' employers. I'm not sure this is the best way to protect workers today for two basic reasons. The first is that Uber, Lyft, and many other gig economy companies today arguably already employ their workers under current law because they exert so much control over them. They would almost certainly be their employers under the PRO Act, and they are almost certainly their employers under California's AB 5. That means those companies already have duties to provide many of those workers' benefits, and carving out a safe harbor would enable them to evade rather than uphold that duty. Second, and here I'll wrap up, we have models for portable benefits that would protect workers. Construction workers frequently move between employers, and long ago they built portable benefit funds that are co-managed by unions. Social Security and Medicare are also portable in that they're provided and administered by public agencies. The best option for workers will likely be benefits that are collectively bargained or publicly provided rather than unilaterally provided. Thank you.
We will now recognize Ms. Griesler. Welcome.
Good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Rachel Gresler, and I'm a research fellow at the Heritage Foundation. The views expressed today are my own and don't necessarily represent those of Heritage. The future of work is already here, and it's not something that workers need to fear. But policymakers can help workers prepare for, adjust to, and thrive amidst these changes. One of workers' biggest fear against the future of work is that they might lose their jobs. And this is a legitimate concern, because without a job, workers cannot provide for themselves and their family, and they have no hope for higher income and opportunity. That's why today's 50-year record low unemployment rate is so commendable. And because of the recent tax cuts and reduced regulatory burdens, workers are experiencing widespread income gains, with low-income workers receiving the biggest gains. But some lawmakers seem determined to stop this with the types of interventionist policies described thus far today. By fighting against innovation, opportunity, and choices, we will reduce workers' incomes and shortchange our entire economy. Technological advancements naturally eliminate some jobs, but they also give rise to new jobs and astonishing new products and services. Imagine what workers in the ice industry thought when the refrigerator came to market. All of those jobs, cutting ice, moving snow, transporting and delivering it, disappeared. But instead of becoming destitute, those workers found new jobs, and most of those new jobs made them more productive. So change creates opportunities, and today's workers have opportunities to earn supplemental income, to be their own bosses, and to interact with a more diverse group of individuals and businesses. So-called independent work used to be reserved for highly educated individuals, such as lawyers and consultants. But today, it's available to nearly all Americans, and as many as 1 out of every 3 workers participates in independent work in some capacity. And nearly all of them, 9 out of 10, say that they prefer being their own boss to being an employee. But instead of more autonomy, many lawmakers want to control workers and employers through policies that will lead to fewer jobs, lower incomes, and less opportunity. Consider the $15 minimum wage passed by the House this summer. When California raised their minimum wage, Muriel Sterling, who owns her own family daycare in Oakdale, California, had to reduce some of her workers' hours, and she had to raise tuition costs, which made it harder for families to be able to afford childcare. And when Michigan increased its minimum wage, Pastor Jack Mosley explained that his faith-based recovery program had to close its Taste of Life restaurant, leaving the program's 12 participants without jobs or, quote, the opportunity to interact with other employees and to talk to customers and feel like they were a part of something. Sadly, disadvantaged and inexperienced workers are the first to lose their jobs when high minimum wages create survival of the fittest labor markets. Then there's the Protecting the Right to Organize Act advanced by this committee, which would overturn 3 Supreme Court cases, strip 27 states of their right-to-work laws, and upend the gig economy, as well as franchising and contract-based employment models. For starters, the PRO Act's pro-union, anti-worker provisions would strip workers of basic democratic rights. Now, as Americans, we may not always support the political candidates that get elected, but at least we're not forced to make financial contributions to them or stripped of our rights to a secret ballot election. Nor would one candidate ever be prohibited from talking about the other candidate's policies. But that's what the PRO Act wants for the workplace. The PRO Act would also hurt a lot of workers by changing the definition of employee. This past summer, my family had the blessing of being able to help a refugee family that had first become jobless and then homeless. Were it not for a temporary job agency that helped this father to obtain work within days of requesting it, that family would not be living in their own home today. Instead of regressive policies, lawmakers can help workers adapt to and thrive in today's labor market by reducing taxes and unnecessary regulations, by advancing choice-based, portable, and affordable benefits, and by giving workers choices over how they work, who they work for, and if they want union representation. Policymakers have 2 options: help employers and employees respond to the changing nature of work, or try to prevent those changes from happening. The former leads to progress and higher incomes and opportunities for all, while the latter benefits a select few with a smaller economy for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Griesler. We will now recognize Ms. Beck. Welcome.
Good morning. Thank you for the opportunity to share my perspective on the important topic of the future of work. My name is Jessica Beck, and I am the Chief Operating Officer of Hello Alfred, a tech-enabled service company I co-founded 5 years ago that's changing the way people live in cities by building help directly into the home. Today, I'd like to share with you our experience as a tech-enabled service company that intentionally chose a W-2 employee model. 5 years ago, my co-founder, Marcella Sapone, and I launched our business founded on a simple idea. Let's give people back their time. Through our app, we offer our customers the ability to request help with anything they need, from groceries delivered directly into their fridge, to pet care, clothing care, handyman services, and more. We deliver against these needs through our Alfred Home Manager staff, who visits our members' homes each week to fulfill their requests. Today, we operate in more than 20 cities across the United States and provide our services through a combination of technology and human help. While our brand is focused on transforming the lives of our customers, from the beginning, we have cared deeply about creating good jobs and meaningful work. When we launched Hello Alfred in 2014, the gig economy was the default approach for tech-enabled service startups. If we had followed this trend, we would logically have made our Alfred Home Managers contractors. This model reduces cost and risk associated with hiring, firing, and wage changes, as independent contractors are not subject to minimum wage laws, and companies have limited responsibility for tax withholding, benefits, insurance, or training. However, we observed that a byproduct of this model was a more transactional relationship between the workers who power these platforms and the platforms themselves, and we were determined to build our business differently. For us, the conversation ultimately wasn't about 1099 versus W-2, but instead about how we could create the right relationship with our workers, not just a cheaper one. We ultimately chose to make our Alfred Home Managers W-2 employees, and as a result, we are able to provide them with a series of important things. For example, systems that enable long-term life planning, including benefits such as competitive healthcare plans for themselves and their families, opportunities to advance their skills and training through learning and development and career pathways, fair compensation. Alfred Home Manager wages have some variation depending on location, but the average is 56% higher than the market's minimum wage. By way of example, San Diego's minimum wage is $12 per hour, but our Alfred's average about $20 per hour. We did this because we believe that an employee-centric approach, where we have a strong, trusted relationship with our staff, ultimately enables us to deliver a better experience for our customers. A more successful workforce creates a more successful business, and we believe there should not be a disconnect between a company's success and the personal success of its workers. The reality is that creating good jobs is good for business, as well as good for innovation and growth. This outlook requires business leaders to embrace the responsibility of shaping a new generation of jobs where we're not commoditizing skills or sidestepping hard-won protections. It's also worth noting that our decision to choose a W-2 employee relationship added cost to our model. We estimated that to be about 20 to 30% more than had we chosen a 1099 model. However, as a business, we also see innumerable long-term benefits to this investment. For example, we have a lower employee churn rate, which translates into lower recruiting and training costs for us. We have an increase in internal promotions and tenured employees who began as Alfred Home Managers, which maintains not only important institutional knowledge, but also leads to new ideas. Some of our best innovations come from this group. We're proud to look around our company and see former home managers who are now trainers, hospitality experts, or even leading entire cities. Most importantly, workers who feel valued and are given opportunities to grow within a company tend to produce an excellent product. We rank high in customer satisfaction and have been able to maintain strong control of our brand by having a consistent, high-quality work from our employees, which is an essential factor in any service-based model. Regardless of which business model employers choose to pursue, there needs to be a concerted effort to provide meaningful benefits, protections, and development opportunities for the people who do work for these companies. When we as business leaders don't make the appropriate worker choice, the impact can distance the worker from the company. This deprives the worker of the benefits that being part of an organization can provide, such as career advancement, learning, development, and training. It also deprives the company of the ideas, lessons, and diversity of skills its staff could otherwise contribute. I'm hopeful that we'll see more stewards of good business practices in the years to come. Employees shouldn't be seen as cost centers, but instead as human beings who are delivering real work and value and deserve the same in return. The result will be good for business, good for the worker, and good for our workforce at large. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Beck. Under Committee Rule 8A, we will now question witnesses under the 5-minute rule. I will now yield myself 5 minutes. Professor Rogers, as companies increasingly contract out for work that they would previously hire directly, how does that exacerbate the challenges workers face when they organize a union or engage in other concerted activities?
Thank you for that question. Outsourcing and subcontracting, fissuring, franchising in many circumstances can impact workers' rights to organize in a couple of ways. One is that workers' primary employer may not actually have any economic power over their working conditions. The company that actually has that power may be a third party, but the workers cannot get that third party to the table. That means that meaningful collective bargaining is effectively impossible. A second challenge is that workers do not have rights to strike, pickets, or really organize or bargain with that third party under existing law. I'll note that the PRO Act would remedy many of those shortcomings.
How does sectoral bargaining prevent individual companies from undercutting wages and working conditions in order to compete?
So the best example of sectoral bargaining in the United States is probably the United Auto Workers pattern bargaining strategy, in which the UAW negotiates a contract with one of the big three automakers and then pushes the other two to match the terms of that contract. Now, that's not actually complete sectoral bargaining because there are still many non-union plants in the country. But what that does is it prevents any of the three automakers from underbidding the other two. True sectoral bargaining would actually lift up wages and benefits for all of the workers in the industry, therefore ensuring that there's a level playing field for all companies.
Thank you. Ms. Beck, can you elaborate on your decision-making process as a founder when you chose to employ W-2 workers, even though it was a more expensive option? Why did you make the business decision to cover these costs?
Thank you for the question. At the end of the day, we were very focused on building a relationship of trust with our customers and also with our employees. And when we considered the things that a business should do in order to do that, the costs were far less than the benefits that we thought we would receive. So if we could invest in our workforce, give them the protections, the benefits that they deserved, they in turn would deliver a high-quality experience to our customers.
Thank you. Professor Rogers, in your testimony, you discussed some of the abuses associated with legal safe harbors, and some companies rely on to deny their workers or employees, even when they are providing them benefits. Why is this harmful, and how would the PRO Act address this problem?
The greatest problem here, in my view, is that the definition of employment under the NLRA right now looks to the common law test and interprets the common law fairly narrowly to require a fairly high degree of control over the work. The test itself, however, is incredibly malleable and incredibly confusing. What the PRO Act does is substitutes the so-called ABC test, which is much more tractable, much more clear, and that would lead to gig economy workers being classified as employees in most cases. As a result, they would then be eligible for most employer-mandated benefits.
Thank you. Dr. Weil, is there a difference in earnings if a worker is employed by a main business instead of having their job contracted out?
Thank you, Chair Wilson. The answer is yes, and the difference can be substantial. Many of the best estimates put that at something like a 20% differential when a worker is doing the same work for often the same organization but has been contracted out to another organization. So the impacts on both wages and also access to benefits can also be quite pronounced and dramatic from a shift like that.
Does the fissured workplace negatively impact a worker's ability to advance within a company? What does this mean for wage growth?
I think that's one of the most profound effects of the fissured workplace that we're only now seeing and putting together in the economic data. The fact that a worker in the old model of employment who was a janitor worked for a company and could enjoy a job ladder within that company. When that janitor is a subcontracted or in other ways a staffing agency worker, that opportunity for advancement is undercut. And that has implications on his or her job, earnings profile over the course of their work life.
Thank you so much. I yield, my time is up. And now, members from questions from members. Dr. Adams, I'm sorry, Mr. Wahlberg, our ranking member, North Carolina.
I love North Carolina, but I choose the beautiful state of Michigan, home of 20% of the world's fresh water, and a beautiful color scheme right now, but North Carolina is a beautiful state to vacation in. Ms. Gressler, Republicans have long championed the expansion of association health plans as an effective and affordable health care solution for many workers. In 2017, I was proud to introduce the Small Business Health Fairness Act with former Representative Sam Johnson to expand access to high-quality, lower-cost health care plans for employers and workers, and see it pass the House. The Department of Labor has also done important work to expand access to AHPs by allowing more employers and small businesses to participate in these plans. In April, I also introduced H.R. 2294, the Association Health Plan Act of 2019, which would ensure continued access to coverage for association health plans established under DOL's AHP rule. In your testimony, you mentioned that expanding access to AHPs would give workers more choice, portability, and portability for their health care benefits. Let me ask you this question. Why are choice and access important to workers, and do you think that increasing an availability of AHPs will benefit workers and their families?
Yes, thank you. We've actually done some polling on this at the Heritage Foundation, and we found that what's most important to families is to have a choice and feel like they are empowered in being able to get access for themselves and for their loved members, and to make some decisions about what type of health care they receive. And that's why association health plans are so important, particularly for smaller businesses. There are a lot of costs associated with finding a health plan and running that. And this association health plan model drives down those costs, not only administratively, but also by bringing together a pool of workers so that they can offer a lower price. And that's something that's particularly important to these small businesses, and something that they have trouble is finding an affordable health plan that both they and their workers can use for their health care. So small businesses, this is something that would help them tremendously.
And they generally want to partner with that because of, I guess, what a question I'd like to ask now about the tight labor market that's out there. We know that job creators offer benefits such as health insurance plans. We've talked about retirement contributions, paid leave to recruit and retain workers. It's just a matter of course that's necessary to have those employees. We also know that thanks to a strong economy spurred on by our Tax Cuts and Jobs Act and deregulatory actions, there are more jobs than job seekers, about 7 million, last figure I saw. So again, how does today's tight labor market affect employee benefits?
Well, we've seen companies expand their benefits because of the tight labor market, something they have to do. They're having to compete to get the workers that they need.
Competition.
There are people out there that are offering $1,000 signing bonuses in lower wage jobs. We've seen a race to the top in the type of benefits that people are offering. They're either health insurance and pet insurance, because that's what some workers are asking for. And paid family leave has expanded rapidly. We now have the top 20 employers in the U.S. A lot of these that are employing lower wage workers like Lowe's, Home Depot, Starbucks, they now all offer paid family leave because it's something that their workers want, and they're responding to that.
And competition, yeah.
Competition.
Ms. Griesler, many businesses use subcontractors and independent contractors because this framework allows for flexibility, ready access to skilled workers, and the ability to responsibly manage costs. These relationships are particularly important for businesses that operate on thin margins, such as small rural hospitals, and I have a number of those, allowing them to dedicate more resources to patient care. The Democrats' bill H.R. 2474, the PRO Act, which was recently approved by this committee, as indicated, codifies a broad and vague standard for joint employment that could make these hospitals the employer of the independent contractor or contractor's employees. What are the primary concerns you have with this joint employer standard in the PRO Act as it pertains to businesses and workers alike?
Particularly, as you talked about smaller rural hospitals, a lot of the businesses simply won't be able to offer the services they currently do or the quality of service that's offered there. I grew up in a small town in Western New York, and after my father and some of the other orthopedic surgeons retired, there were none there. And so they have to contract to bring some in. Similarly, my uncle is a retired physician, and it's a job that he can do, the kind of traveling doctor model. And so you're bringing people who have higher skills than are available in that community. And as a result, patients have access to that higher quality, more specialized care. And that's the biggest benefit of contracting, is you get a more specialized product as opposed to having to use one of your current employees perform, say, 5 different jobs that they aren't necessarily equipped to do.
So better quality and care.
Exactly.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Dr. Adams, North Carolina.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you to all the witnesses. Dr. Weil, currently misclassification is not itself a violation of the Fair Labor Standards Act. So how would making misclassification a violation of LFSA and allowing civil monetary penalties and a private right of action for violations help combat misclassification?
Thank you, Chair Adams. And you've pointed to a major problem of misclassification, and that is because of its use by some employers, it undercuts the competitive position of other employers. Because misclassification in and of itself is not a violation of the Fair Labor Standards Act, it's very difficult to root out those businesses that are using it as a competitive edge. By providing penalties expressly for the act of misclassification and the willful act of misclassification, it would act as a deterrence for those kinds of models, stopping the employers who are using it as a business model decision, and it would also support those businesses that are doing the right thing and complying with the law in terms of their competitive position.
Great, thank you. Dr. Weil, while you discussed in your testimony that wage theft related to the fissuring of workplace can be devastating to low-wage workers in terms of lost earnings, can you elaborate on what the loss of earnings means to a worker practically?
Thank you. I think one of the starkest things I saw as wage and hour administrator were the actual cases of the impacts of the loss of wages by hardworking people because of practices like misclassification, because of the fact that they were not being compensated not just for the minimum wage, but even for hours worked. For a typical family, that could mean up to 4 weeks or 5 weeks of childcare. It could mean the practical things like not being able to pay rent for a month. Because so much of misclassification affects low-wage workers, its impacts are magnified because of how tight those household budgets are, and because in many cases, their real wages haven't gone up in decades.
Yeah, and many folks are just kind of living paycheck to paycheck, and if it's not going to be correct, then it's a problem. Right. So during the Obama administration, OSHA defined a policy where it would hold both temporary worker agencies and host employers responsible for safety and health violations, depending on the circumstances of the specific case. Can you describe for us how that works and whether it's an effective way of ensuring the safety of workers employed by temporary agencies?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the question. OSHA's temporary work policy was very much a recognition of what had changed in the workplace. And it used the fact that it holds responsible not just the direct employer, but what is called the controlling employer, which can be the company that's hiring the staffing agency or temporary working agency, also responsible for complying with laws. And that requirement for both parties, who both have a stake in the game, to take responsibility for compliance with OSHA was an extremely important part of OSHA's enforcement policy and improving or reducing the likelihoods of injuries and fatalities, particularly in complicated work settings where you do have multiple employers.
Thank you. Ms. Beck, do you believe that your employment practices have a positive impact on your brand?
Thank you for the question. I generally believe that investing in good employment practices is good for business and our business at large. And for us, our brand is the thing that we promise to our customers. So investing in a good employment practice enhances our brand, provides our customers with a better product, increases customer satisfaction.
So are you saying that it does have, your practices do have positive impact on your brand?
I believe that to be true, yes.
Okay. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Thank you. Now, Dr. Rowe, Tennessee.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I don't know what economy we're describing, but in my lifetime, this is the best one I've seen. We have 7 million open jobs. The unemployment rate is 3.5%, it's the lowest since 1969. Median incomes are up 12%. Real median household incomes are up $7,000 under the Trump administration to $65,000 plus. African American teens unemployment in 2010 was 48%. It's now at a record low. African American unemployment's at 6%. Latino, the lowest on record. I mean, these are always things we should be celebrating and talking about and how we improve that. And one of the things I think that Ms. Beck and I totally agree with your business model. And when you're done, would you come please send your people over and show me how to use this electronic thermostat I have at my condo? That would be very helpful because I can't figure it out. It is a model that you have that we used in our practice forever. We have an employee that's been with my medical practice for 42 years. And I hope you have the same success we have. And Ms. Griesler, I'm going to go over just a couple of things I think that are important in the sharing economy. When I was a resident physician, we didn't make very much money. And so I needed to go out and work in emergency rooms to make extra money to support my family. It's exactly what you were talking about. I went into rural communities and worked a shift at night or maybe worked the entire weekend to help support my family. It worked perfectly. The other day, I got in an Uber with my wife to go to an event. The person who drove the Uber was a flight attendant who had rented a car that you get off the street. She wanted to make some money so she could work that weekend to have some fun that weekend and not spend any of her hard-earned money she makes on an airplane taking care of me. And she rented the car, drove the Uber, and pocketed the money. I can't think of anything that works better. I thought it was one of the neatest things I have seen in that type of economy, to let people decide what's good for them. And right now, the things that we need in this country, workers, and Ms. Beck pointed it out, are workers with skills, both hard and soft skills. I think that's what's lacking at the lower end. And in our state, in Tennessee, we're trying to do that, providing free community college and free technical school for people to bring those skill levels up so they can make more money and they're more employable. As an independent contracting, Ms. Griesler, as independent contracting varies by industry. A one-size-fits-all policy ignores the complexity and nuances that I just mentioned of such work arrangements and the value they bring to the economy. In your opinion, how would this change in the nation's employment laws affect the millions of hairdressers, childcare workers, other professionals who currently rely on the flexible work arrangement afforded them by their designation as an independent contractor?
Well, I think independent work, the biggest benefit of it is the flexibility and also the ability to earn additional income. There is no cap on the income you earn. When you are in a traditional employer-employee relationship, you are often limited to 40 hours per week to your salary and often prevented from working from anybody else. Only 16% of people who participate in the gig economy use that as their primary form of income. A lot of them are just working on the side, and whether that's just to have some extra spending money, to save for education for their children, maybe for their own education, or to start a business of their own to have some income that's coming in while you're becoming an entrepreneur. Those are all things that are the choices those individuals make, and they lead to better outcomes going forward. And so I don't see how restricting people from being able to earn additional income and being able to have flexibility will be helpful going forward. Flexibility is something that's been particularly helpful to women who are now in the labor market in equal numbers. And without that, I think we'll have a lot of mothers that simply choose not to work at all because they can't find a job that meets their demands.
You know, people are renting out part of their homes, sharing their homes. There's all kinds of things that benefit everyone. Professor Rogers, I've got one question for you. I know you support the PRO Act, but do you support the part in there that doesn't allow for a secret ballot? We just had a letter written by many members that I would have signed the letter on the USMCA agreement requiring a secret ballot for unions in Mexico. And look, if you want to belong to a union, that's your business. You have a right to do that. I think that is the single most important thing we have as an American is a secret ballot.
I support the majority sign-up procedure under the PRO Act.
The question I asked was, do you support a secret ballot so that I can go in there, if I want to vote for a union, I can. If I want to vote against it, I can. Nobody looking over my shoulder.
So the problem is that workers under existing law can demonstrate unambiguously that they want a union, and their employer can refuse to recognize that
My time's
union.
expired. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Courtney from Connecticut.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and thank you to all the witnesses for being here today, particularly Ms. Beck, again, for your testimony that shows that innovation and flexibility in a workforce are not incompatible with the employer-employee relationship. And again, I think it's just a really impressive bit of testimony today that is refreshing, you know, to sort of reiterate that point. Dr. Wheel, you propose ensuring that certain basic protections are tethered to work rather than to the employment relationship. And this includes ensuring all workers, no matter their classification, is paid for their work, earn a minimum wage, or guaranteed a basic right to a safe working environment. Can you just sort of flesh that out a little bit, that, you know, how this would actually work in practice, that using work as the trigger as opposed to the employment relationship?
Thank you, Congressman Courtney. I think what we're talking about is a core set of rights that are so fundamental. We want to get out of this box, are you an employee or are you an independent contractor? Those are legitimate and important categories that I think play very important roles in our workplace and labor laws. But things like not being retaliated against for the use of rights, which is fundamental to our whole system of workplace rights. Being assured a safe and healthful workplace, and being assured that you will be paid for the work you do, to me are fundamental features that we should make sure people receive regardless of their employment status, whether they are an employee or an independent contractor. The mechanisms to assure those might differ somewhat, but you want to make sure that those ends happen when a person is at a workplace, and we get out of this box of figuring out for something so fundamental.
Again, based on your background, I mean, would again, for example, right to getting paid for your work, I mean, tied to work rather than employment necessarily, I mean, would that be housed in your old division at the Department of Labor? I mean, is that sort of I mean, at some point we have to deal with legal structures.
Right, right. I think it could be. I think it could be. And I think we're talking about provision of minimum payment for work, whether that work is done through an employment setting or an independent contract setting. I think the most important thing is to assure that those rules are clear to all people who employ people, and that they make their decisions accordingly.
Okay, and again, I know you've done great work on this issue, written books, and so in the course of your research, do we have any idea about the number of workers who are not covered by OSHA as a result of the fissuring workplaces?
Well, the most direct answer to that would be we know that self-employed workers have no coverage under OSHA. And if you look at that, that's 16 million workers right there. The estimate I gave before, that roughly somewhere between 20% up of the workforce is in fissured relationships, I think also gives one a sense of the lack of coverage of so many of those workers.
And because of that lack of OSHA protection, I mean, do we have any sense of just, the risk level and the exposure to injury and fatalities as a result of that, shortcoming.
Absolutely. I mean, I can give you two quick examples. One is a story that happened for Amazon Flex workers. Amazon Flex workers deliver packages to people but are paid as independent contractors. There have been a number of cases reported of fatalities for those Flex workers working long hours because of the incentive structures. It's also becoming more common in the meatpacking industry, which we know is a very dangerous industry, for certain work to be done at night by subcontractors, and increasingly that practice, as we have found in many other parts of the economy, that subcontracting is done to people paid as independent contractors. And again, because of that misclassification, those workers in very dangerous settings have no OSHA coverage.
Well, thank you for, again, putting the focus on that. I am, certainly believe that as a committee and as a Congress, we can figure this out. This is really not mission impossible in terms of providing basic protections for people and still allowing companies like Ms. Beck to innovate and thrive and succeed. And to say that they're incompatible and that we just have to kind of totally release people into this brave new world, in my opinion, is just an unacceptable level of risk. And we again, as a country, we can do better than that. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Courtney. Mr. Byrne,
Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Alabama.
Good morning, everybody. In my prior life, I was a labor and employment attorney representing small to medium-sized businesses. And you can sort of picture my clients. They don't have HR directors because they can't afford HR directors. They're just trying to make their business go. And it's hard. It's hard to run a business these days. And so when we add complexity to the laws that they have to comply with, you leave them with one of two choices. One is to go through an inordinate amount of expense to try to get legal advice so that they comply with the law, or that they inadvertently fail to comply with the law. That's not helping the American economy. That's certainly not helping the people that work for those small businesses. So I look at the definition of employee in this PRO Act. I got to tell you, even as a lawyer, I look at that. I'd have a hard time advising some of my clients who's an employee and who's not, who's an employer and who's not. We actually had a meeting a year or so ago. We met with some gig workers, and one guy, as I recall, was both an Uber and a Lyft driver. And I asked him, I said, do you consider yourself to be an employee or an independent contractor? And he said, I consider myself to be a franchisee. I said, well, I know you're not that. But even he was confused. So I'm trying to think who we're benefiting here with all this. Now, I know that there is a big push out there to totally destabilize the equilibrium between labor and management under our labor laws, because unions, even under a very, very friendly administration, the Obama administration, continue to lose market share, because what unions are selling, workers aren't buying. They don't have the stuff that workers are looking for. So we think by piling on these sorts of definitions, somehow we're going to give the unions a better chance here. I don't think so. I think you're just going to make things work for small, medium-sized businesses and for those people that work there, because all they want is a job. And Ms. Gersler, you're right. There are lots of young women out there that they want a job, but they want to control their hours, and so they want to work for themselves. But if we make it so difficult for a business to know when somebody's an independent contractor, when they're an employee, those businesses are going to say, well, I'm just not going to hire anybody. I'm going to quit doing it, which means we've cut out opportunities for those young women that have those businesses. I've got them in my own family. So, Ms. Gressler, let me ask you, in light of this definition that they've got of employee and employer under the PRO Act, and based upon your expertise, do you believe punishing small businesses with costly fines for misinterpreting an unworkable definition of employee is the right approach?
No, I think you'll end up driving these small businesses out of business. The PRO Act includes a $100,000 fine for misclassifying an employee. The average income of a small business owner is $73,000 per year. That would wipe out more than their entire income for the year. These small business owners simply can't pay that fine, but they also can't comply with the law. It's so vague what the definition is now under those provisions of an employee versus a contractor they're probably just going to not hire any contractors anymore. As a result of that, you have less specialized services, you're having lower quality that you're providing to your customers. You're going to end up losing those customers to the bigger businesses that do have the money to pay for the expensive lawyers to tell them what they need to do in terms of contract versus employee relationships. It's just going to benefit the big guys and drive out the little guys.
Yeah, and that's what I'm most worried about. You're right, the big guys are going to take care of themselves. They'll be fine. I'm not worried about them. But most people in America work for small to medium-sized businesses. And you go into an area like that I represent in South Alabama, we don't have that many big businesses. Most people, the vast majority of people are working at small to medium-sized businesses. And most of those people just want to go to work every day, do their job, get paid fairly, get fair benefits. And all this stuff we're arguing about up here doesn't mean a hill of beans to them. It really doesn't. But we would make things all this complicated to try to solve a problem that's not really there. So, Professor Rogers, I'm going to ask Dr. Rowe's question again. It's a real simple question. Yes or no, do you support secret ballot elections?
I support secret ballot elections in instances where employees have a legitimate right to choose a union. And
Do you think they don't have that now under the present law?
We have found under our existing law and practices that those rights are simply illusory.
Well, I can tell you from my experience, and I've done dozens of union elections, you are absolutely wrong. They have plenty of rights. They exercise those rights, and taking away their right to exercise that ballot secretly would be a slap in their face, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Byrne. Mr. Morrell, New York.
Good morning. Thank you, Chairwoman Wilson and Chairwoman Adams for holding this hearing, and to all our witnesses for being here today to share their expertise as we discuss the future of work. And I am struck by this. I don't see this necessarily, although I understand why people draw this conclusion. The question before us today is really about independent contractors, the fissured workplace, and not whether you're pro-union or non-union. This is really about how we properly classify people for the work that they do. And the United States is witnessing a rapidly changing workforce as the 21st century economy continues to unfold, and it's critical, seems to me, that we consider the future of work, but we also consider the future of worker benefits. And we know that when an employer-employee relationship exists, the employee has access to core statutory protections under the NLRB, FLSA, and OSHA, but that isn't the case when you're classified as an independent contractor. So this is really important as we sort of consider this. And there's obviously questions to access to health coverage, retirement plans, paid leave, workers' compensation, and unemployment insurance, all of which is by no means guaranteed if you're an independent contractor. I do want to get to another topic, but I was struck by something I didn't entirely plan to ask about. But Ms. Beck, I'm just curious about the model that you use. Are your employees, do they work as other platform opportunities where the worker makes the decisions about when he or she is available for work? Do you sort of log on when you're available to work, or are there set hours? How does that model work?
Thank you. That's a great question. For us, so we do provide all of the protections, benefits, wage, insurance that are commensurate with a W-2 employee relationship. And we also provide sort of a fixed hours in which you can work, but that doesn't mean that every worker of ours works all of those hours. So within the guidelines that we provide, workers they work independently, they work autonomously, and they check in and check out as appropriate.
So if I'm a worker and I typically work 9 to 5, but on some morning I have to take my family member to the doctor, and so for those 2 hours I'm not available, is there a bank of hours that you don't have to work, or is it simply that they indicate that they're not available for that time and work their own hours? And is there a minimum number of hours they have to work weekly? Or I'm just trying to understand the model, because it does seem very innovative, but it also seems, I'm just trying to understand if it works like the other platforms do, who argue that they must be independent contractors and not employees.
I think our business model is, we've designed the system that we use based on our business model. So, but to answer your question directly, There is no minimum number of hours that an employee has to work on our platform, although most choose to work 4 or 5 days a week. If someone has to take time off, they ask for it, they clock out, and then they clock back in when they need to come back.
So there's not, you have X number of sick days or X number of vacation days. They just sort of work when they choose to work?
We have sick days and vacation days commensurate with the laws that we otherwise follow, but it is flexible within those guidelines.
Great. Well, thank you very much, and I agree and associate myself with my my colleague and friend, Mr. Courtney's remarks, that it does seem to me that you can do this and still have an innovative model for your business. That clearly, I don't think, to those who make the argument that you can't have innovation when you continue to have an employer-employee relationship, and I think your example gives evidence of that. I wanted to just shift for a second, and I know I only have a minute, but thinking about retirement plans, particularly as there is a current retirement crisis facing our country, and too many people, young people in particular, building towards a retirement. And I thought perhaps Professor Rogers, you might can you comment on how classifying workers as independent contractors makes it more challenging for people to have adequate retirement?
Sure, and thank you for the question. I think this occurs in a couple ways. So if we're talking about the lower wage workforce, individuals who are classified as independent contractors often have lower pay than individuals who are classified as employees, as Dr. Weil indicated. Because of that, there's simply less money to go into retirement funds even when they're available. The second reason is that many, if not most, companies do not provide such funds to independent contractors, the savings vehicles that they would provide to employees.
This is a great topic. Thank you, Madam's Chairs, for it. Obviously, I'm out of time, but I think we'll have further discussion. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Mr. Morrell. Mr. Taylor from Texas.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Madam Chair. Appreciate this hearing and appreciate the witnesses. Ms. Gressler, you actually represent diversity on this panel. You're the only one without a Harvard degree. Nobody got that one. All right. I just wanted to, I'm very fortunate to represent a very successful community in Plano, Texas, which is actually the highest per capita income city in North America with over 250,000 people. And I have employers that have pursued W-2 employee strategies, and I have employers that have pursued aggressive use of the 1099 structure. For instance, insurance companies that use 1099 contractors to do insurance adjusting. That's the normal model for insurance adjustment. And 1099 contractors and many IT professionals in Plano, Texas, that are using the 1099 model to go in and do piecework, right? So they're going and building a particular technology platform. It's a 2-3 month job. They're going and do that for the next company. They're doing that remotely. And so the 1099 prospect is just a better way for them to do that business. One thing that I've noticed is my state is a right-to-work state, and businesses that come into my state consistently talk about how that is a feature. That's why they come to Texas. We have very low unemployment. Actually, our income growth in the state of Texas in the first 2 quarters this year was 7.5%. Just staggering increases in income growth in Texas as a right-to-work state. One thing that I've noticed looking at the charts is that union membership among young people is actually going down, right? So younger, and so not only are you seeing total numbers for union membership go down, but you're seeing the new generation seems to be less union-oriented, particularly in the technology space, which I have a lot of technology companies in my district. Can you speak to why that is and what's going on? What, in your mind, giving a national trend? I see that locally, but what do you see on a national level?
I think younger workers prefer having more autonomy, and they also want a structure that not only lets them be rewarded for the things that they achieve, a pay-for-performance type structure, but also something that's not just a rigid ladder that has no, they want no cap. They want to have open opportunity so that they can say, my income might double in 2 years instead of I know it's going to raise 3% every year and not go beyond that. And so they want more options, and that's not something that unions are offering. Instead, the unions are rigid pay scales, and they're providing services that, frankly, are not representing the workers themselves. And I think that that's why we see a decline in the desire to be a member when a worker actually has a choice, as they do in Texas is that people are choosing not to be there anymore because they don't want to pay for something that's not benefiting them. And they also don't want to pay for other things that are taking place in terms of lobbying against policies they might be against, corruption that's happening in the unions. These are hard-earned dollars, and if you're going to be contributing hundreds, if not $1,000 of your paycheck to a union, you want to see it benefiting you directly.
Yeah, and then the other thing I just wanted to talk about, just going to talk about the economy growing generally and how, as unions decline, the economy continues to improve. I mean, is there a correlation there, or is that just something that's happening?
No, it's absolutely, you can compare the right-to-work states versus the non-right-to-work states, and over the past 25 years, median income growth, and that's what we're talking about here, is we want workers' wages to go up. That's increased 165% in right-to-work states compared to 99% in the non-right-to-work states. And it's the same thing when you look at employment growth, look at GDP growth. It's all far higher in those states that are right-to-work that give workers those choices, and as a result of choices, more opportunity.
Thank you. And Ms. Beck, just talk about your business model, and it's interesting to hear how you thought through the 1099 contractor versus the W-2, and I think you clearly made the right choice for your business. But, I mean, have you ever, or would you ever consider hiring a 1099 contractor to come in and evaluate your HR system, or to protect, do some IT work, or are you just sort of ideologically opposed to 1099 contractors? You would never consider hiring one?
Thank you. It's a great question. At the end of the day, I think every business has to make the choices that both benefit its business but also its workers. So as a blank statement, we're not opposed to 1099 contractors for everything. Okay. I just think that when you're thinking about your own workforce and your frontline staff and the people who are really driving the core of your business, then the relationship has to be the right relationship. And for us, that was a W-2 relationship versus a 1099.
Sure. No, and I appreciate that at the core of a business. And again, at least in Plano, Texas, we have numerous businesses that are enormously successful, that pay very well, that are using the 1099 model to grow their business and provide a really good lifestyle for the people that have the fortune of living in Collin County. Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Taylor. Mr. Norcross, New Jersey.
Thank you. Appreciate you holding this hearing, talking about the future. And really like the comments from all the folks who start talking about we can look at the future by looking at today. And, the idea of somehow blaming every problem on the union side is just absolutely remarkable. I guess it's the only talking points we can get across. So there are other things other than that. Having spent close to 40 years in the business, when we talk about corruption, where we hear that, it's in the business side of the equation. There are bad people everywhere. But your very own statistics saying that union membership is declining, yet you're blaming everything on the unions is just remarkable. So I'll just leave that. Let's talk about the gig economy and the subcontractors or the misclassification. Yeah, this is a great entrepreneurial spirit. I want to become my own boss. But you know what? I want more than one customer. Mr. Uber of the world, you're my only customer, and I'm an independent contractor. So now I become my own HR manager. I become my own tax consultant. I'm my own safety director, so I'm up on all the current issues. I'm my own lawyer because I might get sued. I'm my own mechanic because now I have to take care of that vehicle. And oh yes, I'm my own retirement consultant. So when I get to those golden years, I might have a few dollars put away. So the idea of wanting to take on all that responsibility so you can make minimum wage is just beyond me why we think this is a really good idea. But let's just hone in on one of those issues. Dr. Wheel, OSHA. I now become an independent contractor. I'm an electrician. I go into a refinery to work as that one-man job. Tell me, what are the chances of that worker being up to snuff on the OSHA regulations?
That's a great question, Congressman Norcross. There are a few problems that worker has. Number one is, as you say, the likelihood they understand the health and safety standards that should be protecting them is probably pretty low because for all the reasons you just outlined. The real problem is if that person is self-employed independent contractor but is being put in that environment and sees a problem, that person has no standing because of that status. So our laws make it very difficult for that person to do anything because of that status. So it's those coupling of that problem of both the likelihood they don't have the information they need in a case like OSHA, and then the absence of their right to complain, which is basic to the whole OSHA system working.
And the legal side of it, they're now, because they are their own company, they're liable for any issues that happen on those jobs.
That's right.
So there's a difference between starting your own company and growing it. And we don't want to dissuade anybody from going and building that great company. But the gig worker is completely different. Do you think anybody from Uber's putting away, I don't know, 15% of the money they earn so that someday they'll be able to retire? What are the chances?
It's a huge challenge because that Uber driver, that Lyft driver, independent contractor working on a platform like that, not only is going to have to cover the expenses for things like gasoline, obviously for paying for expenses on their car, for keeping their car up, but then there are all those hidden expenses that it's very unlikely that they're putting money aside, like long-term retirement. The other thing I would add to that is the Uber platform is really a branded business. I mean, we have a verb we use, we say we're going to Uber somewhere. Mm-hmm. Now that to me says you have a brand there that employs very cleverly a large group of people to make it work. But all the terms that matter to an independent contractor, a true independent contractor, are being determined by the platform.
So this isn't just to beat up Uber, it's just, as you say, it's a verb. And when we look at their model of innovation, doing it through the app, I think is wonderful. The idea of making everybody a subcontractor so they defer all those costs. The Uber driver pays his own Social Security, right? Both sides of that equation. If there's not enough work, do they collect unemployment?
No, they don't. They're not covered by unemployment insurance as an independent contractor.
So with my 5 seconds left, I want to make a distinction. There is a difference between becoming an entrepreneur, starting your own company, and trying to just turf off your cost of being an employee. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Norcross. Dr. Shalala, Florida.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I do want to point out that the House of Representatives does not have an HR office, which I think we should have, obviously. But Dean Weil, you've worked in the Department of Labor, and the Hour and Wage Division, if I remember correctly, was founded in 1938, and you talked about only having 1,000 employees. Would it have made a difference if you had 5,000? Have you thought about how we would manage enforcement in a gig economy, in this new economy with lots of independent contractors, and how we would think about reorganizing not only that division, but the entire Department of Labor?
Thank you, Congresswoman Shalala, for that excellent question. That represents, I think, one of the biggest challenges we faced was the fact that we had 1,000 investigators to cover 7.3 million workplaces. That is a challenge that any enforcement agency always has. But when you layer on it the complexity of what has happened with all of the different forms of subcontracting and independent contracting, it makes it incredibly difficult for an enforcement agency, whether it's Wage and Hour or OSHA or any enforcement agency, to undertake its task as required by the law. I think it requires one to think differently, which we tried to do, be more strategic in how you use those scarce resources. And even with more resources, you'd still have to make the tough choices about where you prioritize your enforcement so that it really has an impact on compliance and improving compliance.
So have you also thought about, I've been on the website 1,000 times, about information for individual contractors that's usable so that so that they know what their rights are. It seems to me that you have to almost reconceptualize the whole concept of enforcement if we're moving to this kind of an economy.
I think that's very true. I think that one has to think about the whole toolbox, that enforcement and vigorous enforcement is foundational. But there's also things, as you state, like education, outreach, trying to make people aware about what the law says they're supposed to do. We use, for instance, administrator interpretations because we wanted to inform the employer community about what the law says and what their responsibilities were.
Thank you. Professor Rogers, how do you think about whether a benefit package ought to be provided by the public sector versus the private sector? You're at Temple, which is on TIA CREF, I think. And for those of us that are academics, we have a mobile, that is, unless our states don't have their own systems, we have a mobile system. I've been taught in 5 universities. And so I have TIA CREF, in all of those places, and cumulatively, it doesn't matter where I've gone, I've had the same pension system.
So thank you for the question, Congresswoman Shalala. TIA CREF is a great example of a portable benefit system that actually works quite well. Because you have a large number of university and college professors around the country that are able to participate, and multiple employers, the different universities participate as well. I think that's a model that can be replicated in industries where we have many, multiple different employers, but we'd have to create incentives for those employers, first off, to treat their workers as employees and to give them generous benefits.
What about buying into those systems for
this
individuals?
What was the last part?
What about buying into those platforms for individuals?
So Washington State has created a mechanism where individuals and I believe very small companies can buy into a public benefit system. That, I believe, covers paid time off or paid leave. There was a proposal a couple of years ago to allow individuals to buy into CalPERS, the California Public Employee Retirement System. And there's a pretty strong economic argument for permitting that because the administrative costs are simply so low, and because CalPERS can negotiate for much better investment rates, fees for investment providers.
It seems to me this is the way we ought to think about it. What existing platforms can we use, and rethinking the enforcement mechanisms at the same time? Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Dr. Shalala. Mr. Scott, Chair. Dr. Fox.
Thank you very much, Ms.
Have you done as ex officio?
Thank you very much, Chairman. I want to thank our panelists for being here today. Ms. Gressler, in your testimony, you mentioned that the biggest growth component in the economy appears to be individuals who are supplementing traditional work with gig-type work. This seems like an important point to consider when crafting federal labor and employment policies. How should we account for the future growth of the sharing economy and the demands of modern workers who seek freedom and flexibility in their work arrangements?
Well, I think we shouldn't stop it from happening is the first thing. And we need to recognize that first, the gig economy is a small portion of total employment. It's about 1%, but it's a huge opportunity for workers. Workers aren't using that as their primary source of income. If you're an Uber driver and you want a steady job, you go to a taxi cab company and you get that. These workers want something that is optional, that allows them to pick the jobs they do, the days they do them, and it's particularly beneficial to less experienced or disadvantaged workers. Think of somebody who has a disability, and they might not be able to wake up every day and be able to perform a 9-to-5 job, but they can say, hey, I feel good today, I can go out and drive Uber, I can do some things on TaskRabbit. And so we're gonna isolate those people and force them to not having a job at all in some cases, or not getting that additional income that they would like for whatever purpose that is, if we try to just kill this sector of the economy.
Of course, this way of work has been around since the beginning of time. When I was in college and working full-time, I typed other people's papers at night to make a little extra money. So those of us who are ambitious and wanted to make money have always found ways to do this on the side. Ms. Gressler, Democrats are so certain that labor unions are the key to the future of work that they're willing to sacrifice workers' own liberties to achieve the goal of establishing labor unions in all workplaces around the country. As you know, this committee recently approved H.R. 2474, the Protecting the Right to Organize Act, on a party line vote after Democrats unanimously rejected dozens of amendments to preserve and protect workers' rights. What are some of the ways this radical bill undermines workers' rights in order to satisfy Democrats' desire to force more workers into labor unions?
There's all sorts of problems here. Everything from taking away an employee's right to not pay a portion of their income into the dues of a union membership. Privacy implications here, having your personal information, including your home address, given to a union when you don't want that to happen. Having a third-party arbitrator step in and be the one that is in control of those negotiations. And then talking about the secret ballot election. I mean, that is a fundamental component of our democracy, is that you have the right to have a secret ballot and have nobody else look at that. If we are going to support this type of provision, I would ask those who do support it if you would also support having people who work for Donald Trump's campaign in the next election be the ones that go to individual homes and take the votes of individuals. Or do we think that instead those people should be able to work and walk into a secret ballot booth to cast their vote?
Thank you. It's especially ironic that these people want to only vote on the MCA if we force Mexico to have a secret ballot for union elections, but not in this country. Ms. Gressler, in your testimony, you point to the fact that small businesses often use contractors. In fact, my husband and I have done that over the years as we were contractors. In fact, businesses with only 1 to 4 employees utilize 6.7 contractors on average. Can you explain how contracting is beneficial to both the business and the contractor, and what might be the impact if the Democrats' desired definition of employee were to become the law?
Contracting is particularly crucial to smaller businesses, and that's why we see them using more contractors. My sister owns her own veterinary clinic in the area. It's small, and there's a number of female doctors there. It's primarily all female staff, and she uses relief doctors to come in, and that's the way they've been able to provide their employees with paid family leave. Without being able to use those relief doctors, they wouldn't be able to offer that. And so this is something that is so crucial to small businesses, helping them thrive and grow.
Thank you. One more question. Can you elaborate on how Congress can better foster an environment that will lead to an even stronger economy, greater innovation, higher wages, and more opportunity for American workers and businesses alike?
Freedom, opportunity, choices. You know, the tax cuts have been doing wonderful things for American families. The average family with children has $2,900 more in their pocket every year, $45,000 over 10 years. And that gives them the choice. That gives them what they want to spend that money on. It helps them afford childcare, all types of opportunities going forward. So whatever we can do on the tax side, a lot of Americans don't realize that's actually everyone's biggest expense. They spend more on taxes than they do on food, clothing, and housing combined. So let's lower those tax burdens. And also on the regulatory side, this is just a huge burden. I don't think that many people have had the experience of running a small business or even employing one person, but it's incredibly complex, and there's this great fear about doing something wrong and being charged huge fines as a result of that. And so whatever we can do to reduce those burdens going forward.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Mr. Scott, our chair,
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Education and Labor.
Thank you. Dr. Weil, 5 minutes went by pretty quickly, and I think did you get to answer all the questions? I think the strategic enforcement was what was left off of your statement. Were you able to get that, what you wanted to say in?
I did, but I'd be delighted to talk further about the importance of that in this workplace.
What do you want to say?
Well, I think as I was responding to Congresswoman Shalala, we face a real challenge under any circumstance given resource constraints, and I appreciate the attention that has been given to the importance of enforcement resources. But we also have to think about how we deploy them and how we work with other parties, and those other parties include state governments, worker advocacy and unions, and employers in making sure that people comply and they understand their rights, particularly given the complexity of multi-employer, joint employer, and rooting out problems like misclassification in the workforce. I think we showed that one could make inroads in that during the Obama administration, but I also think we showed the need for additional enforcement resources for all of our workplace agencies.
Thank you. Professor Rogers, you indicated that it's difficult to form a union today. Can you give a little example of what you're talking about?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Basically, workers face a very high probability of retaliation from their employers when they begin to organize. Sometimes and often that retaliation is frankly illegal. It's unlawful under the National Labor Relations Act, but it's very difficult to deter because the NLRA is limited to awarding back pay, and workers have to actually mitigate their damages in the meantime. So that means if you begin organizing, you have a very substantial risk of being terminated, then waiting months or even years to get your job back. If you're making under $15 an hour or under $30 an hour, workers will, you'll make the rational choice not to stand up in the first place because the risk is simply so high. That's one among many, many problems. I could talk about this for a while.
You mentioned the problem with contract workers. We've said a few things that a contract worker doesn't get that an employee would get, like minimum wage and overtime, workers' comp, unemployment compensation. What about if you're an independent contractor, what rights do you have on employment discrimination?
You have no rights under Title VII. You have some rights under Section 1981 of the Civil Rights Act for racial discrimination, but no rights under Title VII as an independent contractor.
What protection do you have as a whistleblower?
Under which statute? Just in general?
Well, just in general, as a whistleblower, or retaliation for being a whistleblower, retaliation for reporting injuries or an unsafe workplace?
In general, none. If you're not covered as an employee under the Act, you're not covered by the retaliation provisions of the Act. And that's true for the NLRA, FLISA, ERISA, OSHA. And
what could be done to protect workers who may in fact be an independent contractor under present law? How could they be protected for things like minimum wage, overtime, unemployment compensation, workers' comp, discrimination?
Well, I think there are a couple issues there. One is that a lot of workers are misclassified as independent contractors. When workers are misclassified, they're denied rights under all those statutes, even though they really should be entitled to them. Solving that is a matter of changing the definition of employment and holding companies to duties toward workers over whom they have power, regardless of whether they kind of qualify under the common law tests or certain other tests. There are various bona fide independent contractors, but bona fide independent contractors tend to have the labor market power to negotiate for decent wages and working conditions on their own. They're not necessarily the workers who need protection under the Fair Labor Standards Act or the NLRA, for example.
And if you're an independent contractor, you don't have the right to collectively bargain?
It's actually even worse than that. Collective bargaining by independent contractors can be a violation of the antitrust laws. And so an employer could seek an injunction against collective action by independent contractors.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Dr. Scott. Mr. Klein, Virginia.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank the witnesses for being here. It's recently been reported that 50% of millennials and 75% of Gen Zers, according to Forbes, have quit their jobs due to issues related to mental health. These numbers have been steadily climbing over recent years, which makes the conversation about workplace flexibility and benefits an important one. So I commend the chair for holding this hearing today. Keeping options available to workers so that they can choose a job that fits their needs is of the utmost importance considering statistics like these. Employers should be able to give options of benefits to workers, such as Ms. Beck has done with her business, such as other businesses providing benefits such as working remotely, performance rewards, continuing education. These types of benefits make them a more attractive employer and the employee happier. By restricting these choices of individuals that directly impact the workers' well-being Through broad overregulation by the federal government, however, we're eliminating viable workforce options that have brought our economy to where it is today. I would note from Ms. Beck's testimony that when she made the decision to structure her team as employees, it added an additional 20 to 30% cost to the model, more than a 1099 model, due to additional benefit and taxes. Unemployment has hit a 50-year low at 3.5%. This is in large part due to the recent deregulatory efforts taken by the Department of Labor and giving the power of choice back to individuals. The unemployment numbers speak to our success as a nation, but we were founded to create a more perfect union, and I believe in consistently continuing to better it. Expanding employment options is one such way we can keep up with the modern worker and is a way that workers greatly value. So much of the district that I represent in Virginia is rural, and policies like the Protecting the Right to Organize Act would have a negative impact on businesses, but particularly small businesses in rural areas. It would inappropriately preempt and prohibit right-to-work laws in 27 states that value and protect this fundamental right. This is unacceptable and would hurt both the employees and employers in my district. So, Ms. Gressler, can you talk about the impact of bills like the Protecting the Right to Organize Act and how they would impact businesses, particularly small businesses and businesses in rural localities?
Well, by forcing unionization upon workers and employers that don't want that and that wouldn't choose that model, you're dictating both the wages and the total benefit packages that those workers get. And younger workers today place less value on having something like a defined benefit pension. They have high student loans to pay, they might be saving for a home, paying for childcare costs, and it's not necessarily beneficial for them to have 15% of their of their compensation tied up in a retirement benefit, particularly when you look at the union structure, and they've been well known for having strong retirement benefits, but the reality is they can only pay for 40 cents of what they've promised in all of these benefits. And so those workers are recognizing that they don't want to get into a system where a high portion of their compensation goes to a retirement benefit that's actually not going to be there for them when they retire, that will be insolvent by them. And so I think that we need to, instead of looking towards the union model, look towards more portable, accessible, affordable things. The average worker is going to change jobs 12 times throughout their career. They might want something that they can take with them throughout those jobs so that they don't have to change doctors, don't have to roll over retirement plans or start new ones. But let's look towards more portability that can help workers accommodate instead of just driving that out of the market entirely.
Can you also talk about transparency when it comes to union organization and accountability for workers? The act that is under consideration would force the sharing of personal information of workers. And can you comment on that and the impact that that would have on workers?
Yeah, I've talked to workers personally who don't want union representatives coming and knocking on their door and trying to get them to sign cards that they might not want to sign. And we need to have more accountability on these unions, and members or people who are potentially considering voting for or against a union need to know what's going to happen to their money if it goes towards that union. And there was talk about the corruption in there and the fact that this is just normal and it happens everywhere. I don't think that that makes it right, and it actually more frequently happens amongst unions, and workers need to know where their money is being spent, and there needs to be proper disclosure of that.
Thank you. Ms. Beck, are your workers unionized?
Our workers are not unionized, but the thing that I think is important about that is, as an employer, I want to make sure that our workers have everything that they need. So that's why we pay a fair wage. You know, we're 56% above the average minimum wage, provide benefits, career
And I'm glad that you were able to do that. It was an additional 20 to 30% cost in your model, but I'm glad you were able to make the choice to do that. And with that, Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Klein. Ms. Weil, Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm really disappointed that Ms. Fox is no longer here, because I wanted to challenge her to a typing competition. I too typed papers for others in college, but I was 18 or 19 years old, not middle-aged and trying to support a family. I have questions for you, Ms. Gressler. In your written testimony, you say there is nothing inherently wrong with unions, but workers must be free to choose whether to join them. And this is a quote, Congress must not grant them special favors. So I want to talk for a couple minutes about the law on special favors. Under the NLRA, employers can hold as many mandatory captive audience speeches as they like to argue against unionization, but unions cannot compel attendants to hear speeches that are in favor of unionization, correct?
I'm not an attorney. I believe that's correct, but I don't know for sure.
Well, you're here as a witness. Let me see. Let me go to your area of expertise. You've provided us with a congressional testimony on the future of work, helping workers and employers adapt to and thrive in the ever-changing labor market. As a research fellow for the Heritage Foundation, and you're not able to answer that question?
I have not looked specifically at that component of the law, and I can't provide you with 100% certainty.
Well, I won't hold you to 100% certainty. What do you understand to be the rule on that?
That is my general understanding.
Thank you. Under current law, if an employer files an unfair labor practices claim against a union, the NLRA requires the NLRB counsel to petition for a temporary injunction against unions pending disposition of the claim. But if the union files an unfair labor practices claim against the employer, the NLRB has discretion but is not required to seek a preliminary injunction against employers pending disposition of the claim, correct?
I will believe your word for it. I have no idea.
Same answer as before. You're not a lawyer, but that's your understanding,
I'm
right?
an economist, and I do cover a broad area of policies. Labor is one of them, but I am not well-versed in the specific components and statutes of labor law.
Okay. And let me just ask you, are you aware that employers only have to notify employees of their NLRA rights if the employer is found to have violated the NLRA? Unlike Title VII, the ADEA, FMLA, and OSHA, an employer does not have to post and maintain notices advising employees of their collective bargaining rights, correct? Are you aware of that?
Again, this is above my level of understanding of labor law.
Well, let me represent to you that all of those statements are true, and I'm going to ask for confirmation of that from Professor Rogers in just a second, but I would respectfully submit to you, Ms. Gressler, that the unions aren't the ones getting special treatment under the law. Professor Rogers, can you comment on those items that I just asked Ms. Gressler about and confirm one way or the other whether they are true?
Everything's true with one exception, which is that not in all cases does the NLRB have to seek an injunction with union ULPs. That's only when it comes to recognitional and organizational picketing and secondary boycotts.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. Other than that, I'm correct about employers being able to hold as many mandatory captive audience speeches as they like, but unions are not able to?
Correct.
And that employers don't have to post the notices like they do for OSHA and ADEA and FMLA and so forth?
Correct.
Okay, thanks. I have a couple more questions for you, Professor Rogers. As somebody who I practiced law for 30 plus years before I came to Congress. I was a trial lawyer, actually on the defense side most of the time. One of the fundamental tenets of justice that I firmly believe in is that judges have to avoid conflicts of interest or even the appearance of a conflict of interest. And the best ones I knew always erred on the side of recusal to avoid the appearance of impropriety. But as I understand it, the Republican majority of the NLRB attempted to overturn the Browning-Ferris joint employer rule in high-brand industrial contractors by holding that an entity is only an employer if it actually exercised direct and immediate control. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And isn't it true that NLRB board member William Emanuel was a former lawyer at Lidler Mendelson, the firm that represented the employer on the losing end of the Browning-Ferris decision?
I believe that's correct. I don't want to stipulate that it was Littler specifically, but yes, he was involved in the litigation.
Okay. So you wouldn't be able to comment on the fact that Mr. Emanuel did not reveal to the litigants his connection to the dispute, seek a waiver from them, or recuse himself from overturning the Browning-Ferris decision?
Oh, that's absolutely my understanding. And of course, the decision was vacated as a result once the conflict of interest came to light.
Thank you very
Ms.
much.
Weil.
I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Levin of Michigan.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and thanks so much for holding this very, very important hearing, and I salute your leadership. I want to spend my time digging into the possibilities for sectoral bargaining with Professor Rogers, recognizing Dr. Weil's really important work before, during, and after your government service on the Fissured workplace, recognizing that our labor laws are so antiquated, and despite all the protestations about how workers are forced to be in unions and all this nonsense, virtually no workers in the private sector are in unions, 6.4%, the lowest in 100 years. And there's no way workers can rebuild voice and power in our economy without a much freer market for worker representation. So Professor Rogers, stipulating that we must pass the PRO Act and take whatever measures to allow workers to form unions much more freely, I'm impatient. I read your whole testimony, which we always say we read all of your all's testimony, but in this case, I read all of that. And I'm frustrated by the idea that we have to go in stages over a lot of years, but I don't disagree about the practical difficulties of getting to a sort of a European scale of sectoral bargaining from where we sit right now. So how can we do this most expeditiously? And don't put on an incrementalist hat and a you know, we're not Eeyore here. We're thinking big about what the changes we need to make for the American people so they can get their little piece of the American dream, which despite low unemployment and the booming stock market, they don't see ahead of them.
Thank you for the question. So I guess two thoughts, and then we'll continue the conversation. The most expeditious way to at least get some sectoral standard-setting structure in place would be to amend the Fair Labor Standards Act to establish wage boards. You know, under the original FLISA, those were essentially in place to set wages, but it would be plausible. Australia has a system, for example, to use that type of structure to set standards beyond wages. So you could look at scheduling policies, particular concern for retail workers.
But let me just ask you, don't you think we should sort of choose between either going with, you know, wage boards or other, you know, public solutions like that, or sectoral bargaining?
I think the two can complement each other.
Okay.
I mean, wage boards can set minimum standards, and you know they can do more than wages, right?
Right.
In terms of sectoral bargaining, you know, the challenge is that if we all of a sudden convert to a sectoral bargaining model, but still require unions to have majority support before they can bargain, in very few sectors are unions going to be able to bargain, right? So, you know, if you want to act very quickly, you could say, well, in any industry in which unions have 5% density, the union has rights to at least bargain over some topics.
But there's a wide range in other countries, right? Between, say,
Correct.
France with very relatively low worker membership in unions, but very high, participation in sectoral bargaining, and Sweden, where people are sort of mostly 70% are in unions and they have sectoral bargaining. So could we start with France and then move towards Sweden? I mean,
We potentially could. You know, part of the difference is that France has extension laws. Sweden does not, right? So the unions bargain in France at the sectoral level. Then those standards are set across the country through administrative action. That would certainly be a decent starting point in the U.S., but you'd have to have something like a most representative status determination, which is what France does, to figure out who has bargaining rights.
all right, well, I think I'm going to need you and your colleagues to work with us to figure out the best way to get there, because we're facing a situation where one and arguably two generations of American workers are looking at having a standard of living below what their parents had. That's the reality, and we can't stand for that. We need to transform our economy so that workers have power in their workplace and nationally so that they can have a middle-class standard of living. And I'm counting on you. This is great work that you and your colleagues are doing, and I'm looking forward to working with you to make that a policy reality. Thanks so much, Madam Chairwoman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Levin. Ms. Jalapal of Washington.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for to our distinguished witnesses for your testimony. I represent the Seattle area, and obviously we have a lot of technology, innovation, a very robust economy. In fact, an employment rate of 96.9% in Seattle, and we also are the country's first major city to pass a $15 minimum wage, which I was very proud to be a part of. We have the first citywide domestic workers' Bill of Rights, and at the state level, we were the first state in the country to tie minimum wage to inflation. We're also in the top 3 for highest minimum wage statewide across the country. And middle-class workers are about to be paid fairly for their overtime work at the state level. And this is in contrast to the Trump administration's faulty proposal for overtime that leaves most middle-class workers behind. It is no coincidence that Washington State also has one of the highest union densities in the country. We're number 3 in the country. We actually have a unionization rate of about almost 20%, which is double the national average. And so people in my district understand that innovation does not mean worker exploitation. So I want to start, actually go back to Mr. Rogers, Professor Rogers, because I want to pick up on my colleagues' questions to you, and specifically around centralized bargaining and standard setting structures, especially for low-wage industries. As you may know, I've introduced the Domestic Workers' Bill of Rights, H.R. 3760. It creates a federal domestic workers' wage and standards board modeled off of the wage boards in Seattle, California, and New York. And the board would make recommendations on federal standards for domestic workers, including wage recommendations, workplace protection standards, and improvements to benefits. Professor Rogers, how would a federal standard-setting board change the domestic work industry?
So it would change it in, thank you for the question, it would change it potentially in profound ways for the better. As you know, domestic workers are excluded from the National Labor Relations Act. That exclusion goes back to the original passage of the act, and the reasons for it are rooted, frankly, in white supremacy and Southern congressional leaders' insistence at the time that domestic and agricultural workers be excluded from the major New Deal labor legislation as a condition of its passage. They actually supported unionization and fair wages, just not for agricultural and domestic workers, who at the time in the South were, of course, overwhelmingly African American. So that exclusion stands until today. Enterprise bargaining, to shift to the need for a new bargaining model for domestic workers, enterprise bargaining effectively won't work for them because the enterprise is an individual household. So individual bargaining, they already have enterprise bargaining in a way. Sectoral bargaining could do a couple of things. Through a wage board process or standard setting process, it can bring public attention to the challenges domestic workers face. It can set minimum terms and enforce them, and perhaps most importantly, can give domestic workers a voice in that standard setting and enforcement.
Thank you. I mean, this is, to me, one of the most exciting advances in the future of work is the work we're doing with domestic workers. And as one home care worker put it, this is her quote, "The solution is to make sure that workers are at the table on the front end and have a say in how these platforms and programs are developed and run." And I think that's what we've done. Mr. Weil, you ran the Department of Labor's Wage and Hour Administration. You've written extensively on the future of work. The conversation about the future of work is often dominated by a set of platform-based companies who claim that they are so different and so innovative that they should be exempted from the laws that protect workers' right to organize or to be paid fairly, to work safely without harassment and discrimination. And many of these platform-based companies actually refuse to treat workers as employees, and they spend millions to litigate and lobby to evade their responsibilities towards workers. And this is said with deep respect for the innovation that does come from these companies. But they do use measures including deactivating workers without any opportunity for appeal or charging workers punitive fines, setting unpredictable rates of compensation. You've talked about this as fissured workplaces. Tell me the top 3 harms that are caused by these kinds of practices.
Well, thank you for the question, and I think you've outlined them. It is the fact that workers in the status of independent contractors lose basic rights like the right to a minimum wage and the right to be paid, the right to access to a benefit like overtime, all of our social safety net protections, the right to collective bargaining, essentially all of our rights that are very much vested in employment. There are certainly parts of the digital economy where workers are legitimate independent contractors, where the digital platform acts as an electronic market to bring users and providers together. You know, that's the Yellow Pages kind of hyper level
Thank you,
of that.
Mr. Weil. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Weil. I yield back.
Underwood of Illinois.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Dr. Weil, in your written testimony, you pointed out that women are disproportionately represented in the types of short-term and contract jobs that we're discussing in today's hearing. Generally, do these women have access to paid family and medical leave at work, or even unpaid leave that protects their jobs?
Thank you for the question, Congresswoman Underwood. The answer is no. According to a most recent national compensation survey, only about 18% of private sector women have access to paid leave. And if we look at the bottom quartile, that number goes down to only 8%.
Wow. Based on your experiences at the Department of Labor, how does having access to paid family leave and medical leave benefit workers?
In a huge way. Because of the absence of that leave, people face very difficult, disruptive choices of leaving a sick child at home alone to fend for him or herself, or a worker in a healthcare profession having to come into work when they're sick, and not only therefore running themselves down, but exposing other people to their health problem.
Right, and that's awfully burdensome for both the worker and the employer.
Absolutely.
Let's talk about how short-term and contract work affects workers' ability to save for retirement. Now, most Americans with retirement savings have an employer-sponsored plan like a 401k. Professor Rogers, do companies that use short-term or gig workers in the U.S. generally offer these workers access to a 401k or other retirement account?
Not that I know of, no.
And why can access to an employer-sponsored plan be so important to the worker's ability to save for retirement?
Well, I would say access to an employer-sponsored plan of some sort would be really helpful. It's because the savings, especially early during your career, can compound over time. If you save in your 20s and 30s, you can accumulate a pretty significant amount of funding, especially by the time you retire.
And so how does limited access to those accounts affect the short-term and gig economy worker?
It means those workers essentially have zero retirement savings. And I'll also add, I don't think this has been mentioned yet, because Social Security is not withheld typically,
right.
The workers have to withhold it themselves, and they may not be able to do that.
Retirement security is a big concern for my community in Northern Illinois. According to the Federal Reserve, half of workers in this country think that their retirement savings are, quote, not on track. Like many Americans, these workers may plan to rely on Social Security to supplement their income in retirement, but short-term and contract workers, as you mentioned, often receive less from employers there too. So for example, a mom and pop shop at a restaurant that hires an employee as a delivery driver pays Social Security and Medicare taxes for that employee, Professor Rogers, is that correct?
If they're an employee and if the employer is following the law, yes.
Okay, but most of the big food delivery apps that we're hearing about today are set up so that they don't have to cover those expenses for their drivers, is that right?
They're set up to evade those expenses is the way I would put it, yes.
Okay, and so instead, even after tax deductions, many drivers for those companies have to cover those Social Security and Medicare tax expenses themselves, right?
Correct.
The ability to save for retirement is crucial for American workers of all ages, but millennials are facing additional burdens. The Brookings Institution reports that it's more difficult for millennials to save enough for retirement than it is for previous generations. So this is for both Professor Rogers and Dr. Weil. As this committee continues conversations on the future of work, what are the essential components of policy that empowers workers and provides retirement security, especially for younger Americans, that we need to keep in mind? Let's do Dr. Weil first.
I think the key is portability. I think both sides talk about portability. I think it's something we have to provide all workers so that they can work in situations of multiple employers and be able to save. But one can do that compatibly with also the protections we have under our employment laws.
Okay, thank you.
I would just add to that, designing portable benefits in such a way that workers have a voice in their design and administration, and just general protections for the right to organize and general workplace protections, which will make it easier for workers to save for retirement.
Thank you. While the future of work has the potential to offer many workers new flexibility and opportunities, we must ensure our policies and laws evolve at the same time to ensure that anyone who works full-time can provide for their family. We must also ensure that these workers have access to high-quality health insurance by protecting the Affordable Care Act and by lowering costs that make health coverage out of reach for far too many. I've introduced legislation to address this, the Healthcare Affordability Act, which would make insurance more affordable for nearly 20 million Americans, including many of the workers we're discussing here today. Thank you, Madam Chair, for holding this important hearing, and thank you to all of our witnesses for being here. I yield back.
Madam Chair.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Underwood.
I have a unanimous consent request. Madam Chair, I'd like to introduce the following reports into the record. A 2018 Data and Society report entitled Beyond Disruption, How Tech Shapes Labor Across Domestic Work and Ride-Hailing. A 2019 Institute for Policy Studies report entitled Protecting Domestic Workers' Rights, and a statement by SEIU entitled The Future of Work, Preserving Worker Protections in the Modern Economy.
Without objection, so
Thank you,
ordered.
Madam Chair.
Ms. Stevens of Michigan.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to our witnesses. I thoroughly enjoyed reading through your testimony. I come from the great state of Michigan, where the UAW strike is on everyone's mind, and it's very visceral, it's very real, it's been going on for a long time. We know that we've reached a tentative agreement, but that our UAW workers are still out there on the picket line. And part of why they are striking is in part of what we are discussing at today's hearing. UAW contract negotiations, as they've gone on throughout the years, workers have been able to fight for increased wages and better benefits. And unfortunately, this model, this bargaining model, has become increasingly less common. Although the conversation I had with one of my regional directors earlier today was that they believe that the work they are doing and that the strike that is taking place will have global ramifications. So, Professor Rogers, how do we encourage this type of model of sectoral bargaining across other industries?
So the auto industry is actually, it's a really nice example of some of the merits of sectoral bargaining, because pattern bargaining got the UAW close to sectoral bargaining for long periods of time, and still in some ways gets the UAW close to sectoral bargaining. With two exceptions, basically. There are, as you know, quite a few non-union parts suppliers into the auto workers today. Then there are also many non-union plants that have opened, especially transplants by foreign automakers, that have remained non-union. So one of the challenges the UAW and the U.S. automakers face is wage competition from those other entities. Sectoral bargaining could set a wage floor and end that unfair competition.
Yeah. And what type of role do portable benefits play? And as negotiations are going on for current portable benefit systems, could you speak a little bit about that? You mentioned it in your testimony, I think. I know you talked about building wealth and protecting healthcare pensions, but I don't know if you can talk a little bit about portable benefits.
I mean, I think in general, providing high-quality benefits that workers can get access to regardless of their skill levels and who they work for is essential. Portable benefits is part of that. I'm a little cautious about a full-throated endorsement of portable benefits because in some cases, the proposals for portable benefits have essentially been framed so as to let many companies off the hook for duties they already owe toward workers.
Yeah. Well, and obviously we're here today talking about worker protections. And Ms. Beck, I know from your testimony, which was really well done, and your model is one to be commended. And I think the conversation around the future of work in the 21st century age and how we grow a 21st century labor movement really speaks to maybe something that you could shed some more light on at a 10,000-foot view, which is how we drive innovation, but also ensure that workers' rights are protected.
Yes, thank you for that great question. I very much believe that investing in our workforce is investing in innovation. And the examples that I would give you are, when our Alfred home managers are in the field or working with customers, it is their ideas and their observations that ultimately become the next great thing that our company does. So I think it's extremely important to view the relationship between a workforce and innovation as a very positive thing.
Yeah. Well, at this time, I'd like to thank our two fabulous chairwomen who lead subcommittees on education and labor that I sit on. And this is exactly what we're doing on this committee, which is advocating for the individual worker and the voice of our economy that's relying on good and sound practices. And thank you all so much for your time and expertise today. Thank you. I yield back the remainder of my time, Madam Chairwoman.
Thank you, Ms. Stevens. I remind my colleagues that pursuant to committee practice, materials for submission for the hearing record must be submitted to the committee clerk within 14 days following the last day of the hearing, preferably in Microsoft Word format. The materials submitted must address the subject matter of the hearing, of this hearing. Only a member of the committee or an invited witness may submit materials for inclusion in the hearing record. Documents are limited to 50 pages each. Documents longer than 50 pages will be incorporated into the record by way of an internet link that you must provide to the committee clerk within the required time frame. But please recognize that years from now, that link may no longer work. Again, I want to thank the witnesses for their participation today. What we have heard is very, very valuable. Members of the committee may have some additional questions for you, and we ask the witnesses to please respond to those questions in writing. The hearing record will be held open for 14 days in order to receive those responses. I remind my colleagues that pursuant to committee practice, witness questions for the hearing record must be submitted to the majority committee staff or committee clerk within 7 days. The questions submitted must address the subject matter of the hearing. Closing statements. I now recognize Workforce Protections Ranking Member, Ms. Adams, for closing statements.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you all very much for being here. I do want to echo my appreciation to the witnesses for taking the time to be with us today. The Fair Labor Standards Act and the Occupational Health and Safety Act were passed with the core mission of guaranteeing workers fair wages, reasonable hours, and safe workplaces. Yet, as our witnesses made clear, under the fish-used workplace, workers today are facing a race to the bottom that undermines basic worker protections. In response, Congress must take bold, decisive action to protect workers. I look forward to working with my colleagues to improve the lives of workers and to restore the purpose of our essential labor and employment laws. So thank you again to our witnesses for your testimony. The takeaways from this hearing will provide important context as we look ahead to our next future of work hearings. These hearings will focus on how we can empower workers with competitive and in-demand skills to avoid displacement and protect workers' civil rights. amid the growing use of platforms and algorithms in employment-related decision-making. But most importantly, today's hearing will help guide this committee's continued efforts to improve the lives of workers and serve our constituents. I yield back, Madam Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Adams. I now recognize Workforce Protection's ranking member for his closing statements. Mr. Byrne.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and I appreciate this hearing. The title of it is The Future of Work, Preserving Workforce Protections in the Modern Economy, and I think that's a very important topic. I appreciate all of the witnesses being here today. I would have liked to have heard from a worker. I do talk to workers a lot, not just when I'm out doing my thing as a congressman, but sometimes when I go around visiting businesses, I want to talk to the people that work at the businesses. How you doing? How's the place going? They seem pretty happy to me. We have 3% unemployment in Alabama right now. There's a recent study out that shows that the people who benefited the most in terms of wage performance are people at the bottom. We're seeing wage increases like they haven't seen in many years. I've yet to have one person at any of my town halls, at any of the businesses I've visited, anywhere, come up to me and say, I don't think I have enough workforce protections, or anything close to that. They're mainly worried about making sure that we're going to have an economy that produces the jobs that they need to make money and provide what they need to provide for their families. I encounter a large number of people who are working in what I consider to be alternative type work situations. That's just the future, I think. We talk about the future here. I think that's the future. We have fewer jobs where people show up for the same place 9 to 5, and more situations where people will be working out of their homes or in other situations. And I don't think our laws match up with that. I don't think they do at all, because we hadn't rethought them in decades. And we still have this old mindset that we're all working in factories, doing the same repetitive thing over and over again. If you've been into a modern factory, you know that's not the case anymore. It's dramatically different. We've benefited a lot in the state of Alabama from a manufacturing resurgence, automotive, aviation, you name it. And when I go in those places and I see how they're producing what they're producing, it's unreal. It's like going into some sort of a science fiction movie the way they do it. And they're constantly innovating, and the innovators are the workers. It's not the management that's doing the innovation, it's the men and women on the line. And it's really cool to watch them do what they do, by the way. They're really good at it. Not once have I had one of them come up to me and say, I wish I had a union. Not once has anyone ever said to me, I wish I had a union. I'm afraid if they had sat through this hearing today, they would say, that doesn't have anything to do with what I'm thinking about, what I'm concerned about in my job. Now, notice in everything that I've said right now, I haven't talked about the people that own the businesses or run the businesses. I'm talking about the people that work there. And I think we've missed the mark today. I think we should be sitting down and talking to those workers and say, what do you need? You know, my experience is most of the people that own and manage these businesses do that. They sit down with their workers and say, what do you need? Because they can't be a successful business if those employees are not working at maximum efficiency, maximum quality. Now, there are more and more people, as I said, becoming independent contractors. And I think we have to understand they're doing that by choice. They want the flexibility that comes with that. And here comes the big federal government, put a bunch of new regulations out there. They're going to make independent contracting very difficult. So I wish we could have a different hearing where we brought in the workers and we asked the workers, what do you need? And I think we would get a very different set of answers than what we got today. Thank you for holding this hearing, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Byrne. We can say that the workers need workforce protection, and that's what our committee is slated to do as we move forward. I'm going to now recognize myself for the purpose of making a closing statement. I want to thank our witnesses for their compelling testimonies today. This hearing revealed the challenges posed by the changing relationship between employers and workers. As we heard from today's witnesses, the increasing share of workers hired as subcontractors, temporary workers, or independent contractors is undermining workers' rights and protections. We know that innovation has the potential to improve the lives of workers, but Congress must ensure that innovation does not come at the expense of our nation's labor laws. At the end of the day, we have the responsibility to preserve and strengthen workers' rights. Today, we discuss some of the opportunities we have to pass legislation this Congress that will improve the quality of life for workers and their families in the modern economy. As we move forward, I look forward to working with my colleagues to advance bills like the Protecting the Rights to Organize Act, the PRO Act, which will help reduce income inequality and expand access to the middle class. I also look forward to a continued discussion on how we can meaningfully expand benefits for workers and how industry-wide bargaining can truly achieve improvements for workers in the fissured workplace. If there is no further business, without objection, the committee stands adjourned. And thank you for coming.